Hi everyone, this is just a test video I thought I'd put together while I figure out how to actually give talks on the internet. I thought I'd reprise an academic writing lecture I gave sometime last year. These are exactly the same slides I used then, and not all of them will fit the current format, but hopefully it should be interesting. Anyway. So the basic argument I was making during these lectures was that academic writing skills are founded on writing skills, which are in turn founded on communication skills, and that in order to teach academic writing skills, I actually need to start with communication skills. So this is what this lecture is about. It's mostly a talk on how to explain things to people, not even really in a writing context. I'm sort of assuming that you're explaining something to someone one-on-one, because I think of the sort of communication skills you need in academic writing, this is really where everything starts. It's if you can't do this basic task, then you probably can't do any of the harder things. And so it's important to spend some time on figuring out how to get things right when you actually want to explain something to someone specific. And the theory I'm going to be working on as part of this is that explanation is helping someone to understand something. Its explanation can mean all sorts of other things, but that's what I mean today. In particular, there are a couple of things I don't mean by explanation. You can't make someone understand something. There's no way I can explain things to you so well that you just have no choice but to understand it afterwards. You might not even speak the language I'm speaking. You might not know any of the background I have. You might just sort of stick your fingers in your ears and go la 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 la. I cannot force you to understand something. All I can do is help you to understand it. Explanation is also not persuading someone. The line here is a bit blurry. It's sometimes you will need to persuade people a bit, particularly when they've made a mistake. And sometimes explanation is a key part of persuading someone. But generally speaking, the sort of explanation that I'm going to be talking about is when someone is receptive to having the concept explained to them already and is open to you helping them do that. And most of your time will be they will be on side, and you won't be having to persuade them you're correct. It's also not showing off how clever you are, and I really shouldn't need to say this, but based on how many bad explanations I've seen, I think I kind of need to say this. Like, a lot of explanations are bad, and I'm sure this isn't deliberate, but it does feel like they're bad in a way that is designed to make the explainer feel better about how clever they are. And so they don't do any work to simplify things because they want you to struggle to understand the material in the same order they did. They don't sort of provide you the helping hand that you actually need if you're going to be explaining something. And so often when you are explaining something to someone, it will feel like you're really having to dumb it down because you're an expert and they're not. And so it may. And so if you're doing a good job, it should sound like everything you're saying is really simple. And the closer you get to that ideal, the less clever you'll feel while doing it, but the better an explanation it will be. There's some things that explanation can include. If I occasionally seem confused, by the way, it's because I haven't really looked at these slides properly. You might be teaching someone something entirely new. You might be clarifying something already known. For example, if you are tutoring someone who has already attended classes, explanation will be much less about teaching them new material and much more about figuring out where they're confused in the material that they in theory already know. Explanation can just be like a way of helping people organize knowledge, where you take things that they already know and sort of draw their attention to the relationship between them. You help them sort of connect up existing facts. You help them revise the same thing over and over again until it actually properly makes sense. It's entirely possible to provide a useful explanation to someone who already understands things because it makes them go, ah, yes, I knew that, but I didn't know I already knew that. Which, in fact, was the next item where I was going to say, making implicit knowledge explicit. You see this a lot, for example, when I'm writing my newsletter. A lot of it is things where people read it and say, I knew this, but I couldn't have explained it that way. And so it's still useful, all in that regard. But fundamentally, an explanation that I'm talking about in this lecture is always about something. You're always explaining a thing. You cannot explain everything. I'd love to explain everything, but you can't. It's always directed to someone, and it's always directed to someone. You cannot explain in the abstract because you have to help someone understand, and you have to do this in a way that they are actually able to engage with. So here's the 3-part method I use to explain anything to everyone. First of all, you need to determine what you need to explain, because explanation is always about something, and you need to determine what the thing your explanation is about. You need to determine what the audience for your explanation already knows, so that you can use that as the foundation for helping them understand things that they don't already know. And you need to clearly express the first in terms of the second. So explanation is primarily about building on someone's knowledge by using what they already know to increase the things they know by relating the new information to the old information, or relating the piece of information you're trying to explain. I'm mostly going to focus on explaining technical subjects to non-technical people because this was an academic writing course for computer scientists, so this is a good thing that they're going to be doing a lot in their career, and I've worked with a lot of software developers, and many of them could have used a course on how to explain technical subjects to non-technical people. And also because this serves as a very good foundation for explaining technical subjects to technical people, which is what you need to do in academic writing. The next slides won't be all that relevant to you, but basically I was starting with an exercise in developing empathy, which I think will work very well for our first-year computer science students, which is that I gave them this. This is a definition for you. Let X be a topological space. A sequence xn of elements in X converges to X, an element of X, if the filter generated by the tail sets of Xn converges to X. And for context, they would have, in parallel to this course, have just been doing their first year mathematics course, which contained a whole bunch of stuff about sequence convergence. It would not have contained this definition. So let me ask you this. Is this a good explanation? And no, it's not a good explanation, but it is in some contexts a great one. I really like this definition for reasons that I will not get into because this is not a mathematics lecture, but it is an explanation that was fundamentally unsuited to the people who I was giving it to because they did not have any of the background required to make sense of it. It required them to understand what a topological space was, what a filter was, what filter convergence is, what a generated filter is, and what tail sets are. And they knew none of these things, so obviously the explanation was always going to be as clear as mud. You may have missed this one, or you may not have, but it also requires you to know what a sequence is. A sequence is a relatively obvious concept, but if you've not done much mathematics, there are going to be technical meaning in the details of that, and it is just possibly a new concept for people. Oh yes, and it wouldn't help them pass their exams is the other reason it was bad, because it is a definition that would probably be nonsensical to any of their examiners as well. So generalizing from explaining non-technical subjects to explaining technical subjects to non-technical people, the broader focus is just any specialization to anyone without that specialization, which can be because you are writing about some incredibly niche area of computer science, or it can be because and you're explaining to other computer scientists, or it can be because you have a different specialty. You're a front-end developer explaining something to a back-end developer. You are in marketing and you're explaining how a marketing campaign works to the CEO. This is something that essentially everyone with I mean, not everyone, but most people will at some point have to explain their jobs to someone who does not do their jobs. And it can be useful to develop this skill in this context. Here I set an exercise. You are obviously not in a lecture hall in real time listening to me speak, so you can do this exercise now or later as you prefer, or more likely you won't do it at all. But the exercise is this. And it's basically just a role-playing exercise. It's one of you is role-playing as a medical student, the other is as yourself, in this context, a first-year computer science student, and you are trying to explain what actually is a web browser. And at the time, I got people to break off into pairs and report back to me, and they did, and I don't actually remember how that went. I think it went reasonably well. And we got a wide variety of answers. Here's Wikipedia's answer, which is that a web browser is a software application for accessing information on the World Wide Web. When a user opens a particular website, the web browser retrieves the necessary content from a web server that displays the resulting web page on the user's device. Similarly to our definition before, here are the things that you need to know what they mean if you want to understand the Wikipedia definition. I mean, I'm assuming if you're reading a Wikipedia page, you probably have some idea what a web browser is, so I sort of see why they might have done that, but it's not necessarily going to clarify anything if you give that to someone. You also need to know what a software application is. You need to know what a user means. A user is seems obvious, but actually it's quite a specialized term for computers and doesn't always mean the same thing. You need to know what a device is. It's like, is a smartphone a device? Is a laptop a device? Its device is not actually necessarily going to be the first word that would come to mind for a computer. And there were other terminological issues there, but like most of the rest are things that, yeah, it's probably fine to assume people know those. Here's what I suggested, which is that a web browser is a piece of software that lets you access documents and applications that people have made available, even when they're on a different computer than yours. This has a lot less detail than the Wikipedia definition, but I think is still somewhat more useful for most people who are likely to be asking the question. But the big problem with this explanation is that it doesn't start with the question to actually sort of dig down a little bit deeper, because what you should really say is, why do you want to know? To which the answer might be, the site I was on told me that my web browser was unsupported and I should use Chrome. So often when someone's asking you a question, it's worth spending like a little bit of time to figure out the what should you explain part, as well as the what are you explaining part. And we sort of run into two problems here. The first is the curse of knowledge, which is that when you understand something, it's very hard to imagine not understanding it. And this is a completely universal thing. Like literally everyone suffers from this problem. But it's worth trying to bear in mind, and it's worth trying to back off a little bit from it and sort of try and engage with people where they are rather than where you think they should be based on your own expert knowledge. And the other is what's called the XY problem, which is that people often ask about X when they really want to know about Y. So the what is a web browser question, and for example. And it's not necessarily bad to also explain X, but it's worth making sure that you are solving their real problem. So in determining what you want to explain, you should resist going into too much detail because it's really easy to overwhelm someone. You should try and focus on useful information and let them ask for more detail if they need it. Sorry, slide confusion again. And you should really combine these two. Basically, like you should feeding them as much detail as they want, rather than deluging them with far more detail than they can possibly take in. I mean, don't make them drag it out of you, but one of the easiest ways to fail at explanation is to explain too much and as a result have them not take any of it in. And the nice thing about a one-on-one conversation is that you can do this much more interactively. And so it's really easy to calibrate the right amount of detail, at least when you compare it to doing it in writing or the like. When determining what the audience already knows, assume that it's less than you think. This is the curse of knowledge, and it's very... Unless you go really overboard, you'll probably never lose an audience by assuming less knowledge than they have, but you will almost always lose an audience by assuming more knowledge than they have. But they do know more about you than you about the context. They know why they want to know this. They know about the problems they care about. And so you can really engage with them, and you can ask them questions, and you can use them to guide your sense of what's actually useful and important there. So we've talked about the first two parts. We've talked about determining what you need to explain and determining what the audience already knows. And so now we'll just talk a little bit about how to do the third part, which is just as hard, which is to clearly express the first in terms of the second. And I'm mostly just going to do this by providing you with a couple of useful tools that should help you figure out what you need to do. The first of these is what's called a lie to children. This isn't actually original to Pratchett, but I think he popularized it from some educator. And a lie to children is a statement which is false, but which nevertheless leads the child's mind towards a more accurate explanation, one that the child will only be able to appreciate if it has been primed with a lie. Yes, you needed to understand that, they are told. So now that we can tell you why it isn't exactly true. Turns out that you don't stop lying to people when they're children. No, when they stop being children, and this is useful at essentially every stage. Adults need lies to children just as much as children do. And so when you are explaining something, when you are explaining something to someone, often it was worth brushing over details. It's worth giving them like a simplified version of the truth. Usually it's better if it's not an outright lie. For example, the explanation of the web browser I gave, I think nothing in there was actually wrong, but it skipped out a lot of steps. And usually that's the best sort of lie to children to go for. It's more of a you don't need to care about that now than it is necessarily a strict falsehood. Another thing that's important is to provide supporting examples. When you're explaining something, you should not just give out the abstract principle, you should give the specific examples of the abstract principle and show how it applies. So in this lecture, for example, I've used the questions, what is a web browser, and the definition, a sequence converges if, etc. And those are sort of supporting examples. And it really helps to provide people with supporting examples because it means that you're not relying on them to be able to process the full abstract definition themselves, and you can hold their hand through understanding it. It's useful for your own sake to put together a concept list of like not just the high-level thing that you are trying to explain in the course of your explanation, but also like the prerequisites, everything that you hope they will come out of the explanation understanding. This is more useful in writing than it is in one-on-one explanation, but thinking these through is quite helpful for when you have some opportunity to prepare in advance. So some concepts that we've talked about in this lecture are that explanation is helping someone understand, cursive knowledge, concept list is itself a concept. It's also helpful to put together personas for your audience. Again, this is more of a preparation in advance thing. We've seen this a bit when I'm asked people to do a role play as a medical student. That's a user persona. You can imagine a lecturer who might possibly need some explanation on how to give clear explanations. And by thinking about these personas and what they need to, you can sort of prep in advance and figure out what different people need as different explanations. And even if you then are explaining one-on-one to someone who never exactly matched your personas, having gone through this exercise in advance will help you to have a better sense of what you need to do. I've apparently not really kept these is very separate from writing, because this one is a straight up writing tool rather than an explanation tool. But particularly now in 2020, probably you're leaning more heavily on written explanations anyway. And this is very simple. A beta reader is someone who you give your material to in advance before you give it to the person it's intended to. And this helps you get a different perspective, even if they are no better at explanation than you, because they are a little less close to the material. It's often worth starting with a more complicated explanation and editing it down to essentially go. So remove concepts from it, remove terminology from it, and use this as a way of doing the easy thing first, which is explain to someone who is essentially super smart and happens to know everything about the subject except for the one particular thing that you're trying to explain, and then kind of pare away at that, saying, okay, but this user persona would not know that, so can we remove that bit from the explanation? Replacing longer words with shorter ones, not longer, like obscure words with common words. Particularly removing academic terms and jargon where they're not needed. Not all jargon is bad. Like, jargon serves a very useful purpose. If you have to replace a word with a sentence, that might not be the right thing to do. It might be better to just explain the word. But if you are just using a word because you want to sound clever, maybe see if there's an equally good common one. Running your text through UpGover 5 is often quite a good way to do this. You will almost certainly want to throw away the UpGover 5 results, because UpGover 5 is not actually at all clear. But it's a good exercise to figure out which parts of your text you can actually transform. I should say UpGover 5, what it does is it forces you to write in, I think, the top 500 most common words in the English language. And so it really is a good training exercise for how to explain things without using any of the complex terminology that will potentially lose people. And yeah, you should go one thing at a time. You shouldn't try to explain too much at once, because if you are building on a foundation, then it's important to make for that foundation to be reasonably firm. So if you lose them in the first step and you then build three things on top of that, then they're not going to get any of those three things. And so the earlier in the process you are, the better it is to try and really bend it in and really make sure they understand, so that when you haven't lost them by the time you come to explain the next thing. And then I gave them another exercise, which is basically the web browser one again, but with a programming language instead. And again, feel free to do this or not as you prefer. So yeah, that was an experimental run-through of my academic writing course. I don't expect that many of you have made it to this point, but if you have, thank you for watching. I think I'm supposed to say like and subscribe or something, but that's not really what's going on here.